Hello everyone, this is Seth Garrett here, and today we're going to be delving into a theory of consciousness. Very ambitious, an attempt to solve the hard problem of consciousness. And obviously, I'm not an expert on this. I've been trying to puzzle this out in my mind. I don't know the answers, but this seems like the most intuitive theory that I can come up with so far. So hopefully you like it. If you think I'm wrong, let me know. I'm trying to figure out the truth, so maybe we can work together to figure it out together. So in my prior videos, I've addressed the hard problem of consciousness. The problem of dualism, basically, is it seems like we've got this material substrate, and we've got this spiritual substrate. We've got our bodies, and we've got our minds. The question is, why does this mind or the spirit exist? How do we explain that in intuitive or logical or scientific terms? If you want more background on the hard problem of consciousness, I made another video dedicated just to that, so that will let you really sink your teeth deep into what exactly this problem really is. But, assuming you're on board, let's get into my theory of consciousness, which I am calling energism. Premise 1. We know that energy is more primary or more fundamental than matter. What does that mean? Energy creates matter, and matter reduces to energy. Einstein figured out in his equation E equals mc squared. The E stands for energy and the M stands for matter. So they're equivalent entities that are merely conversions back and forth. So we know that energy is the source of matter, or the root or the true essence of matter. Premise 2. We know that consciousness exists. This was proven by the philosopher Descartes in his famous line, "I think, therefore I am." The fact we can doubt everything that exists, but the one thing we can't doubt is that we are conscious. Because in order to perform the act of doubting, we have to utilize our conscious thinking in order to do it. So that's kind of a epistemic primary. It's that we can grant. Premise 3. Our intuitions guide us to think that it is illogical for consciousness to come from matter, or to merely come from dead materials. This premise, it's an appeal to intuition. This is very subjective and vulnerable to criticism. But as part of the argument, as an appeal to intuition for this premise, we're going to assume that our intuitions are correct. Premise 4. We know that brains are the source of our consciousness. As I kind of explained in more depth in my video on the hard problem of consciousness, it seems very obvious from neuroscience that the brains are creating our conscious experience. If you damage one part of the brain, if you damage the visual cortex, you lose vision functionality. You damage the audio cortex, you lose the ability to hear properly. You damage the language cortex, you lose language. So there's a very strong correlation between the materials of our brain and the consciousness produced by our brain. Premise 5. We know that brains contain only matter and energy waves, right? If we try to break down what is a brain, we've got the material substrate of the brain, and we've got the energy signals of the brain. Unless I'm forgetting something, there's just those two elements of the brain. Okay, maybe a theist will say, oh, there's a spirit. But since we don't have evidence for spirits, or we don't have good evidence for spirits, I'm not going to grant that as part of the argument. Premise 6. If our consciousness doesn't come from the matter in our brains, then it must come from the energy waves in our brains. Conclusion. Consciousness comes from the energy waves in our brains. So based on these 6 premises, we can conclude that consciousness comes from energy waves, or energy waves can be reduced to energy. Consciousness comes from energy. And just kind of a very abstract way to easily think about some of these definitions, energy is kind of like a liquid-like innate power, the ability to do work. Energy is liquid-like because liquid is very transformable, malleable, flexible. When I say primary or fundamental, we're referring to that which is former to, that which originates others. So back up here I said energy is more primary. Energy comes before matter. Matter is like the solid innate objects It's the solid version of energy. It's the materials that follow the laws of physics. Consciousness is that which it is like to be, the experience of awareness. Just to make sure we're clear on the terms. Russellian Monism. I believe energism could be categorized as a type of Russellian Monism, or perhaps a Russellian panprotopsychism. There's more information sourced here. I believe Bertrand Russell wanted to point to a more fundamental unit as the basis for matter and consciousness in order to solve the problem of dualism. Don't worry, I'm going to explain this further. The problem of dualism. The principle of parsimony, often symbolized in Occam's razor, guides us to prefer the more simple of two explanations of reality, given that both explanations have equal explanatory power. A universe that comes prepackaged with two miracles is less simple and hence less likely, less probable than a universe that comes built with only one miracle. Since reality seems to comprise both materials and mind, that's the dualism, the dead stuff and the alive stuff, the natural stuff and the supernatural stuff, supposedly, it seems like we have evidence that our universe has two miracles. Many theories of reality desire to reduce reality to just one miracle, just one or the other. And reducing reality to just one miracle is called a monism. And that reduces the miracle burden on our universe. The less miracles, the more probable. And so it's a better theory, a more probable theory, if we can get rid of one of these miracles. Most monistic theories of reality are unsatisfactory to our intuitions because they deny the reality of half of the duality that we experience. We experience both of these aspects. We experience both of these miracles. Metaphysical idealists deny the material half of reality. Material reductionists deny the mind or spirit half of reality. Most people accept the reality of both, but then they perhaps feel forced to abandon parsimony and accept this dualistic aspect of nature. They have to accept two miracles. They have to accept how unlikely that is. And for theists, they just accept it gladly. They're like, oh, miracles don't bother us. That's just evidence of God. But once you get past theism, once you're like in the realm of atheism, miracles are troublesome. It's like, that's unusual. That's unlikely. We want an explanation for that because it bothers our, that atheistic intuitions. So when we want to have a theory of reality, what we should be doing is looking for explanatory power first. And dualism, at face value, it has the explanatory power we want. It gives us both halves of reality. But it's somewhat epistemically ugly because it requires two miracles. Hegelian synthesis. If we were to view this problem through the lens of Hegel, metaphysical idealism might represent a thesis that is contradicted by material reductionism, its antithesis. At face value, these two theories seem contradictory and mutually exclusive, as if we must choose one over the other. But with a Russellian monism perspective, we can try to go deeper and look at the problem from a different vantage point. If we can find a deeper principle beneath the dualism, perhaps the conflict can be resolved in a synthesis. Russell posited that there was a deeper thing, quiddities, that could resolve the gap. If we reduce reality to quiddities, we have achieved parsimony by requiring only one miracle. Then these quiddities can have the innate power to transform into both materials and mind. Quiddities means whatness in Latin. So just to try to rehash that a bit to make sure it makes sense, we've got the two miracles of mind and material, and the dualism issue is that there's two substances. We've got a miracle to produce the substance of materials, and then we've got a miracle to produce the substance of mind. Two different types of substance. But if we can reduce both of them into one coherent, transformative substance, a primary substance, this is one substance, a monism, but because of its transformative capabilities, it can split into two substances. And so this prior monism, this deeper monism, this more fundamental monism, is a Russellian monism that solves the problem of duality, and it gives us our parsimony. We can have just one miracle, produce this one fundamental substance, and we get everything, right? And this is where my hypothesis comes in. Energism. Energy seems like the most likely candidate for being titled our fundamental quiddity. Energy is already known to transform into everything we know. Energy transforms into matter, into space itself, into electricity, into magnetism, into gravity, into movement and acceleration, into heat, into potential, into mechanical, chemical, ionization, nuclear, chromodynamic, elastic, mechanical wave, sound wave, and light, electromagnetic radiation. All of these different transformations of one thing, energy, each transformation having a variety of properties, completely different properties. If energy can already transform into so many forms, with so many different properties, why not energy transforming into consciousness as well? Why not energy into qualia? Why not energy into mind? Panprotopsychism. My understanding is that panpsychism imputes consciousness to matter. This would imply that atoms have consciousness. Panprotopsychism introduces the idea that there is a dichotomy between consciousness and proto-consciousness. If we define consciousness as complex awareness qualia, then perhaps proto-consciousness could be something like the building blocks of awareness qualia. Perhaps at the smallest level, chemical reactions produce sparks of proto-consciousness. But if that spark isn't captured by a network of energy, there's nothing to pay attention to that spark, nothing to feel that spark. Perhaps at the smallest level, there are good and bad sparks of proto-consciousness. When a proton is able to attract an electron, perhaps proto-pleasure is released as a spark. When a proton loses an electron, perhaps proto-pain is released as a spark. But since atoms don't have brains or a network of energy, there's nothing to process these feelings, and they disappear into nothingness. But in a complex life form, we have eons of time to figure out how to process these feelings in a way that helps us survive and thrive. As a simple analogy, perhaps the feeling of pleasure is something like the aggregation of a bunch of protons succeeding at attracting their electrons. And then similarly, pain is something like the aggregation of a bunch of protons having their electrons ripped away from them. Director of Neuropsychology in the Neuroscience Institute of the University of Cape Town, Mark Solms posits that homeostasis is the fundamental principle behind the valence of pain and pleasure. So just to make sure we're clear on our terms, proto is a prefix that basically means the original, primitive, precursor version of something. So a prototype is like the initial attempt at making a new product. It's like a crappy version of an invention. So it's the first initial primitive, crude version of something. So proto-consciousness, it's this crude type of consciousness that doesn't accurately reflect the more complex and refined form. Qualia is just the subjective feeling of any variety: pain, pleasure, redness, greenness, tasty, yucky, fragrant, sticky. Qualia is the phenomena of sensation. Homeostasis, it's referring to a stable internal environment despite changes that are present in the external environment. It's the ability to regulate oneself against chaos. Stability is, so according to Mark Solms' hypothesis, stability is interpreted as pleasure, instability is interpreted as pain, because instability in the environment is going to alter and fluctuate your homeostasis. So I've emphasized a lot how perhaps proto-consciousness comes from the elements, and that's a very panpsychist perspective. But I don't think my energism theory of consciousness is necessarily tied to, particle consciousness or particle proto-consciousness. I think there are other ways of interpreting it. So if that point bothers you, don't get too stuck on that point, because there might be other ways to formulate this. Emergentism. Emergentism is the belief that something isn't fundamental, but rather emerges, or comes into being as after a process. For example, water isn't a fundamental material in the universe. Water is an emergent property of joining oxygen with hydrogen in a warm environment. Similarly, wetness isn't a fundamental property of water, but is rather an emergent property of large amounts of water adhering to an adherable surface. Under emergentism, consciousness is not a fundamental attribute of materials, like atomic particles, but rather consciousness is something that happens only after a certain amount of complexity is achieved. Emergent energism. So this is just appending the philosophy of emergentism to the theory of energism. Energism as a theory of consciousness should be a large enough umbrella to include panpsychism, panprotopsychism, and emergentism. My personal bias is towards emergent energism, but I'm open to other alternatives. So this is a little diagram. It shows how different theories are related and bucketed. So a Russellian monism is the most general and broad theory, because this Russellian monism, it's not limited to energy. It could be something else like quiddities. Energism gets a little bit more specific. And then within energism, you have panpsychism, which is atoms are conscious. Panprotopsychism is atoms have a crude building block of consciousness. And emergentism, which is atoms don't have consciousness, but somehow it emerges out of atoms in a complex way. Scientific discussion. Professor John Joe McFadden from the University of Surrey posits that consciousness is, in fact, the brain's energy field. Robert Pepperell, Director of Vision Research at Fovitec and Professor at Cardiff Metropolitan University, puts forward a model of consciousness that comprises three things: energy metabolism, which is intensity, energy organization, which is complexity, and energy looping, which is self-referential recursion. Quote, subsequent research has directly investigated the connection between brain metabolism, how the brain regulates energy conversion, brain organization, and levels of consciousness by combining EEG measures with PET scans, a more specific measure of cerebral metabolism. Chenu et al. 2017. This study collected data from 104 patients in varying states of consciousness or conscious impairment using both techniques. By analyzing this data, they determined a metric that discriminated levels of consciousness to a high degree of accuracy. This study built on previous work by Demeritz et al. 2015 that used fMRI technology to correlate a measure of intrinsic functional connectivity in the brain with levels of consciousness. The PCI method has been further validated by a study combining EEG and 18F fluorodeoxyglucose FDG PET Bodart et al. 2017. So reinforcing the link between levels of consciousness and the organization of metabolic activity in the brain. So just to double down on that point, metabolic activity is how the brain is burning energy. And so the burning of energy, that's the place where you might be able to get a conversion of energy into consciousness or qualia, right? If you want to transform energy into consciousness, a good place to look is metabolism, because you do the chemical reaction, energy is released, but into what form is it released? Evidence from studies on the neurological effects of anesthetics suggests that consciousness is lost as distant regions of the brain become functionally isolated and global integration breaks down. Lewis et al. 2012. This suggests that the presence of consciousness in a wakeful person depends on a certain level of functional integration supported by cortical feedback loops. Endelman, 2004, Alkier et al. 2008. But it is not known how or why. So here's a couple of sources for some of these thoughts. So I want to come back to this this perspective, or the variety of perspectives on energism specifically. Specifically, I want to explain how, just kind of posit a couple explanations how emergentism might work. Because like I said before, you might be uncomfortable with panpsychism and panprotopsychism. It might seem uncomfortable to accept that atoms have some type of consciousness, right? Well, one of the most popular theories of consciousness is the idea that brain signals, brain signatures, brain patterns, right? These energy patterns in the brain are equivalent to qualia, are equivalent to your subjective experience. This is a viable type of energism, I would say, because the energy of the brain is the consciousness. We're reducing consciousness to energy, and that's the energy is still a fundamental quiddity of nature. So this energy produces the materials of our body. Energy, it also produces the qualia, which is the specific energy patterns in the brain. So I think that's a type of energism that lots of people could jump on board with. But to me, it's not fully satisfying. The idea that the pattern of a brain signal or a brain wave is equivalent to qualia, it's not satisfying to me because there's kind of a miracle involved here, right? So you could say like the shape of this energy pattern is a type of qualia. One shape of energy pattern is red, another shape is green, another shape is the taste of chicken, the other is the taste of salt, the other is the sound of music, the other is fingernails scratching on, the chalkboard. So all of these different shapes of electricity are producing vastly different qualia. To me, each of those transitions is a miracle, right? Because the shape of the electricity, it's not inherently a qualia. It's not inherently a sensation. Like, you have to, from the foundation of the universe, the laws of physics there needs to be a law written into the laws of physics that says, if you organize energy into this shape, it produces redness. To me, that's like a miracle. It's like God saying, there shall be redness, right? It's kind of a divine proclamation. If this is organized in this way, redness appears. It's a little bit too magical for me, for just a pattern of energy to magically obtain a new property, which is redness. Because these energy patterns, I think most people would agree, they don't naturally have qualia associated with them. Only when they get to a certain pattern, then they absorb a new property, which is the qualia. So the fact that our brain or our bodies have so many different types of sensations, this theory of consciousness, it seems like too many miracles. It's like you've got the miracle of taste, you've got the miracle of sound, you've got, all of these miracles need to be written into the foundation of the universe. That's a little bit too much to ask for me. So you could viably ask, well, if it's not that, what is the theory of consciousness? What's a better explanation than that? Well, it's really hard, because you could say, okay, maybe the energy metabolism of the brain, maybe when these energy transactions are taking place, these chemical reactions, maybe the energy is being converted into a qualia. But that's kind of a miracle in and of itself, but we already grant that energy can convert into lots of things. So there's a lot of miracles built into energy already. So giving it the ability to transform into qualia, that seems more acceptable. The varieties of qualia, I guess that's just, it's another miracle, but at least it's less arbitrary, I think, because theoretically there's laws of physics for qualia, right? If we've got laws of physics for gravity, if we've got laws of physics for thermodynamics, if qualia is a type of energy, there should be laws of physics for qualia. And so the fact that you can apply the laws of physics to qualia and produce different types of qualia, I guess I'm okay with the transmutation of energy into qualia and qualia into varieties of qualia, because we know that energy transforms into matter, and matter, there's a whole variety of types of matter. So it seems to be intuitive at that level. I think the main problem with this energy converting into qualia paradigm, or the emergentist paradigm, right? The emergentist paradigm, we want to say it doesn't happen at the atomic level, it happens at this macro level. The problem with that perspective is that all the laws of physics boil down to the microscopic level, right? The laws of gravity boil down to quantum gravity. Laws of electricity boil down to quantum electricity. The laws of heat boil down to quantum thermodynamics. So all the laws of physics seem to come all the way down. And so if qualia is a property of the universe, if there are laws of physics for qualia, I kind of feel forced by my intuitions to say, maybe there is a quantum component to qualia. All right, so I think that about summarizes my theory of energism. But you may be asking a further question. It's like, okay, Seth, suppose I accept energism. Why would we evolve in such a way as to utilize qualia, right? Theoretically, systems could be designed to not rely on the laws of physics for qualia. Why not just rely purely on non-conscious properties, right? In fact, you could make an argument that qualia is expensive. If it is, now I believe this is an empirical question, whether or not energy can transform into qualia, I think that should be discoverable by the laws of physics, hopefully. So I could be completely wrong on this. I could be completely debunked by any physicist who actually, or a neuroscientist who actually understands how the energy works. So if I am very open to being completely wrong on this. But assuming this is true, assuming that we discover that energy can transform into qualia, assuming that that's a possibility, it still brings up the question, why? Why do it? Like AI robots. Theoretically, we can design AI intelligence that doesn't rely on the production of qualia, right? That should be a specific energy transformation that only happens under specific circumstances. And if we don't design those circumstances into our AI robots, they're not going to have qualia, right? Those are logically deducible conclusions. And when we look at the human body, our brain is very expensive. it's burning 20% of our entire body's energy, even though it occupies, I think, like 4% of the body mass. So it's doing way more than it should be doing on a weight basis comparison. And that gives further support that the brain is using lots of energy. What is it doing with that energy? Like maybe it's producing qualia. Well, we know we have qualia, so somehow that's happening. But if it takes extra energy to create qualia, why would it evolve? You'd think that that would be an evolutionary detriment, right? So let's get into how evolution of qualia might work. So this is obviously a lot of conjecture, so take it with a grain of salt, but these are some of my thoughts on the evolution of consciousness. So we can examine this against our own experience. We all know what it feels like to be groggy or sleepy in the morning. It would be fair to say that during these times we are not operating at 100% consciousness. We are less intelligent, less aware, less reactive, less creative, less capable, and even less happy during these times. As consciousness increases, different functions within our being become more aroused, more accurate, more functional, more beneficial. What this means is that based on our own experience, we have evidence that consciousness is evolutionarily important, at least for our structure. Based on the way we're structured, we need consciousness, because better function requires better consciousness, as evidence within ourself and our experience. So a second order question might be why? Why does better consciousness give us better functionality? My bias is to believe that consciousness is the way different parts of the brain communicate with each other. For example, with less consciousness, when we're groggy or sleepy, the visual cortex and the planning cortex can't communicate with the motor cortex properly, so motor movements are less well planned, resulting in tired, sluggish behavior, tripping over things because we're not paying attention visually, etc. I am biased to think that as evolution occurred, multicellular life arose from single cellular life, right? The transition to eukaryotes. The multicellular life was an aggregation of different unique lives. So during this transition from single cell to multicellular life, there needed to be a system of communication. In order for one cell to control or coordinate with another cell, a system of punishments and rewards might have evolved. All of the cells work in harmony, and if they don't, a punishment might take place. As life evolves upwards, these rewards and punishment systems become pleasure and pain. If one part of the body harms another part of the body, the injured part of the body triggers a pain response to punish the other cells for harming it. Right? So theoretically, the reason why computers don't have consciousness is because computers have designers. Different bits in a computer didn't need to evolve bottom-up emergent systems of cooperation based on rewards and punishment. Instead, computer bits are programmed to cooperate with each other through top-down design. So what does all this mean? If things are autonomous, right? We've got little individual cells. If they're autonomous, the only way they're going to cooperate is if they benefit each other. And so if they fight each other, they repel. If they benefit each other, they become symbiotic, and then they combine into a larger structure. And so I believe the history of evolution is something analogous to the dichotomy between the competition where things are fighting, and then things slowly combine as they cooperate. But during these systems of cooperation, because it's bottom-up emergence, there's still a level of autonomy, right? Maybe some of the parts of this system, maybe they get selfish and they say, well, I want to eat a bigger share of the food, and since I'm maybe on this organism, I'm closer to the mouth, or I'm closer to the digestive system, so I'm going to take more than my fair share. Well, all of these things, in order to be successful, they need to be able to force each other to cooperate. And so based on homeostasis, based on these rewards and punishments, it's like if you don't give me what I need, then I'm not going to give you what you need. And so this larger system is forced to cooperate. And so they can't be so selfish so as to sabotage the other parts. And so maybe these sensations, the qualia, is how they communicate. It's like, oh, if you don't cooperate with me, I'm going to trigger a pain response for you. And so because of that pain response, they're going to learn to they're not going to betray you. And so they're going to do good to you. And then you can say, oh, because you were good to me, I'm going to chemically trigger a pleasure response for you. You're going to give them pleasure. So it starts to sound panpsychic at this point, But it's a spectrum. You could say, well, maybe it's just chemical at that level. Maybe it's chemical rewards and chemical punishments. And then maybe that evolves upwards into more complex qualia. But again, the qualia, it comes from somewhere. We've got to figure out where it comes from, because it comes from somewhere, because we know we have it. But hopefully this kind of sketches out a framework for how qualia might be useful in bottom-up emergence, where it's not needed in top-down design. And just to elucidate a little bit further on the top-down design portion, when you have a designer, the designer is saying, I want all of these units to cooperate with each other, and I am going to design you in such a way that I force you to cooperate with each other, right? When a computer programmer is writing software, he is forcing all of the different modules to communicate and to cooperate as he designs, right? So because there's a designer, it's forcing the cooperation, and so the cooperation doesn't need to emerge through systems of reward and punishment, right? Like one module of software, it doesn't need to torture another module until it gives it the data. They just naturally give each other data because that's what they are forced to do by design. But you could imagine nanobots with little AI software modules, independent, autonomous robots. They could possibly evolve qualia through systems of reward and punishment if they had to evolve like we evolved, right? If little cellular-sized nanobots had to give each other rewards and punishments in order to build a larger robot, in order to cooperate at higher levels, if that was their path of evolution, they might evolve qualia similar to ours by designing a system of rewards that becomes a type of pleasure, or a system of punishments that becomes a type of pain, or fear, or excitement, etc. So that sums up my perspective on the evolution of consciousness and how it relates to energism. I hope you enjoyed that. Obviously, this is just my perspective. I fully expect to find myself in 10 years viewing this as completely wrong, but hopefully this kind of builds a framework of some new ideas that maybe these new ideas can provide a platform to maybe think about other perspectives in new ways and maybe launch us to a better perspective in the future. So if you liked it, think about considering subscribing and checking out other stuff on my channel.